would like to thank our top sponsors, Børge Mo, Mathias Proy, Eivind Josten, Sean Roberts, and Fergus Ryan for making this show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Tonight's guest is a traditional architect and the vice president of the Swedish Architecture Uprising. Despite friends and family warning him against choosing the classical path as a way of living, he was certain of his values and founded his own architectural firm, Tradition Arkitekter, drawing only classical and traditional buildings. He argues that city planning is a democratic matter and that we must start developing greater democratic basis for what is being built. As social media has made the architecture more open, are we witnessing the fall of the modernist hegemony? I'll let my guest answer that question. Erik Norin, welcome to the Cave of Apelles.
Thanks a lot, Carl.
It's a pleasure having you here.
It's a pleasure being here.
I'm curious to hear more about your path to becoming a traditional architect. It's not very common in Sweden, not very common in Scandinavia, not very common anywhere in the world to choose that path. How difficult was that journey and how did it all start? Why did you want to become a classical or traditional architect?
When I was given this kind of question earlier in life, I just said, I do love architecture and I've always had. But in this context, especially when I was asked to bring some pictures, I thought a lot about the reason I chose to become an architect. And this picture here is actually also the picture I have in my bedroom at home. This is the main street of my beloved hometown, Sundsvall. It's a very special city in a way because it all burnt down a hot summer day in 1888. So the city was no more overnight and they decided to rebuild it. So because everything was rebuilt almost the same time, it's a very, very continuous style. Almost everything fits together in a perfect sense. It's said that it's the first city coming from the north and it's the last European continental city coming from the south. So I grew up having this as my city to go to. And I realized that the difference between the village I'm from and the city is mostly how everything's organized. And the city is very organized. It's a clear border between what's a street, what's a park, what's a building, compared to the countryside. So early in life, I created an interest for those kinds of buildings, especially the city center. And I realized I loved them. I wanted to live there. So I studied my hometown, the history of it, and especially the architects behind it. And all of those architects in the 1890s who drew those buildings went to the Royal Institute of Technology. So I wanted as well. So I think I was probably 10 years old when I decided I wanted to go there, even though university is probably quite early to think about when you're 10 years old. But actually going there to the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, I got a shock because it was nothing of what I expected from it. I thought that an architecture school would be a center or a school or an organization where you were taught how to design beauty, how to do beautiful things, study beautiful things, study architecture. But in my view, it's more like a hobby. It's more like a center where you do random architecture things. You design cardboard boxes and you do drawings of cardboard boxes and you discuss things that I wasn't interested in them at all, and most of the teachers didn't know anything about the buildings I was interested in. So I was really disappointed at the school system. I was really disappointed at the curriculum at the school. So
were you not warned by anyone?
I weren't warned in terms of what I had to expect from the school, but I was probably very naive because I didn't check it either. I had this glimmering dream of what it was supposed to be like. So in a way I was probably very naive. But I think that kind of shock also was the fuel that made me continue to search knowledge for what I actually thought was interesting on the side of what the school gave me.
That's I'm thinking back to my own childhood because I wanted to become an architect when I was very young.
Fantastic.
But I was warned. I didn't have that that belief in the in the school system because I was warned that no, that's not how they draw anymore, and it's all on computers and it's all. And then when I was, I don't know, 10, 12, 13, I was like, well, then I put that aside. So I'm very glad that you started there because this has led to fantastic things. So what happened when you started the Royal Academy?
Yeah, I must just say that you probably had people around you when you were quite young who knew about the university system, and I didn't. And I'm grateful for that now. But in general, I was so disappointed of what they were trying to teach us, or inform. It's in my view, the curriculum at the Royal Institute of Technology and also around Europe, around the world, has nothing to do with knowledge in general. It has to do with experimenting. It's a kind of center to experiment, to find your own personal way of expressing, to find an expression that suits you as a designer. And very often you get weird exercises that's not at all connected to the real challenges you have as an architect in society. It's very much defended in a way from the real life as an architect. So it's like a dream school that's not connected to the real challenges you have. And I realized that quite early, and so I decided to do the bare minimum in the classes I thought was uninteresting, and I tried to study by myself, study the classics, read Vitruvius, read Palladio, and it took 3 years, but I found people who were like-minded, who were not in architecture school, but had the same kind of belief and the same kind of ideas in terms of what architecture should be and what an architect should be able to provide a society with. So I found some kind of comfort in people who were like-minded, and without those, for example, Mikael Diamant, who was part of this show earlier, without those people I wouldn't have had the energy or the power in my kind of way to finish school, to go through it all. Because knowing that there are people who share your views, and knowing that there are people who support you, more than just a parent who supports you because you're their child, but really people in society who believe that what you believe is probably the right thing to do, or at least something which is towards the right thing. So that fueled me a lot to actually finish and do school throughout. But when I was given a chance to provide my own exercises within school, or when we actually got to design a proper building within the school, I always tried to do the most classical for myself. For example, we got an exercise to design a library, and we had a program with all the square meters and all the amounts of toilets and everything within. I looked at it, but the challenge I gave myself was, how do you design a stacked order? How do you proportionate a facade to get a Doric column within a pilaster facade to stand upon an Ionic column? How do you get a Corinthian column to land perfectly upon that stack of columns so it looks stable, so it looks natural, so you get the harmony within it? So that half year I read only proportional text from antiquity about how do you proportionate a column in a facade. So in some way I created my own kind of side education within the school. And when I presented those projects for critiques or critics within the school or other students, most of them thought why are you doing this? Like, there is no value in this. It has no meaning. Stop. So I did finish school, but I guess it would have been a lot easier just doing modernist boxes.
But was it accepted that you did the classical?
I had to fight
work?
for it. I had to fight for it. But I guess if I hadn't been so stubborn as a student, demanding to have the right to do this, it would have been harder. But since I had this support from other people, especially within the Architecture Uprising, I had the courage to actually stand up for my right to do this. But yes, I was challenged, I was criticized, but it was allowed.
And how, so the professors there, they did not encourage this, I understand, but did they actively discourage it?
To some extent they did. This is a personal matter, of course. Some tutors were very friendly and interested, but my major problem was they were also honest to say, we can't help you if you're doing this because we know nothing about this, so there's no point of you to do this because we won't be able to help you. We won't be able to give you any advice, which is it's an honest thing to say from a tutor, but that also meant you're throwing this time away and you should give this to someone else. So I was not encouraged, but I wasn't hindered either. So I got the chance to do it at least, but the critiques were quite uninteresting because the focus was always on something else. Like I was almost never criticized for what I actually designed, but always for the reason I chose to design that way, which in my eyes is not a good way to develop as a student, because a good critique of something you do should always be in what you did, not why you did it.
So it was during those years of study that you became engaged in the Architecture Uprising.
Yes, this group of people who I'm talking about who supported me.
Did you found the uprising together with some other people?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
So,
and maybe you can, since here in Norway and Scandinavia, everyone knows about the Architecture Uprising, but maybe for our international listeners in the States and everything, perhaps you could give a short explanation what the Architecture Uprising is.
Absolutely. I brought this picture with the mass of people holding a banner, and it says, "Stop the uglification." So the Architecture Uprising is an organization founded on social media, and it's a group of people who want the traditional architecture as a phenomenon to be the norm. As a movement, we want to enhance the chances of producing beauty again. We want beautiful cities, we want beautiful houses, and we also want to defend the culture-built heritage we already have. So we want to work against demolition of already existing beautiful historical buildings and preserve them the best way possible. But the main thing we're doing is actually bringing the subject of architecture and city planning into politics, or at least popular politics. So when we started in 2014, none of the Swedish political parties had an architecture or city planning agenda. Now, some years later, all of them have. So we brought the subject of architecture and city planning into the dining tables, into politics, into the news. So lots of people started to be engaged in this kind of questions. Like, we want to know and we want to be part of how we design our common spaces, how we design our cities, and how buildings in cities and villages look. We want to be part of this. We want to have our opinions heard. So the Architecture Uprising has been kind of a system within social media to make these questions heard in society. And I think we've been very successful doing it.
And you started out being 4 people.
Yes.
And now you are how many?
Internationally, I think we're 160,000 or something like that. Yeah. Norway is the strongest nation today. I think in Sweden we're like 58,000 members on social media.
Yeah. And but Sweden has although Norway, the Norwegian Architecture Uprising has passed you in numbers of members, Sweden has had the success for a longer time. So it was very interesting, since there is an upcoming election in Sweden. You sent me some pictures of how many political parties that have slogans such as "You don't have to build ugly," and more voice or louder voice to the locals on how a building should look, and build more beautiful and everything. And it's from, as I've understood it, from at least center left to the right.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's something that's been very surprising, that our movement has been widely accepted within all political parties and political movements. So as you say, if you stroll around the Swedish city this week, since we have an election next week, lots of the commercials on buses or in the subway or on the street actually says this, like, no more boring concrete boxes, vote for the Liberal Party, or we want more beauty, vote for the National Party, we want this and that, vote for this party. So it's been a question that's gone from almost uninteresting in a political arena to something that's actually worth putting on a slogan, which means a lot. I'm very proud of being part of that process. So this is probably one of the core things with the Arkitekturupproret Uprising. Lots of people say in Swedish Arkitekturupproret, which means the architects' uprising. But instead it's Architecture Uprising, which means it's a subject of architecture we're discussing. It's not an uprising for architects. So what we're trying to do, or what is actually already happening, is we want to make the question of how we build into a democratic question. We want the people of our democracy to be able to decide for themselves what kind of environments they want to live in.
So maybe you can share some secrets on how you have succeeded, because it's very true and very recognizable what you say, that before this architecture uprising really took off in social media, it was conceived as something that was for just especially interested, a very niche. That you're into classical architecture, then yes, you have a small group of people and no one else cares. That's my experience from the magazine I run, Civilization magazine. When we wrote about classical architecture, I remember even though it was positive feedback, it was I like the articles you write about classical architecture, but it's obviously for those who are interested, like especially interested people. It's you should try and expand a bit more, because this is not something that everyone...
It's way too specific.
Yes, way too specific. So what's the secret or some secrets for succeeding in making this grow into a movement?
To be honest, I'm not really sure about this myself. I've been very surprised in terms of the enormous impact this has had on Swedish society, on Norwegian or Finnish society or Estonian society. But to start with, this is nothing new. What we're doing has been done for at least 100 years. If you open a newspaper from the 1930s in Sweden, you'll find comic strips trying to debunk modernist architects or modernist architecture. There's one strip from the 1940s where there's a man walking with a female, and he says, "My son is working in a box factory." And she said, how interesting, how come? Because he's becoming an architect. So what we do in terms of the debate is nothing new. But what we did is we kind of brought this into a new packaging, which is social media. So we had no funds. It's all a non-profit organization. But we realized early in the process within social media that people react very harsh to before and after pictures. So one of the clickbait versions we did, because people tend to spend no more than 5 seconds on their Facebook scroll on a specific post. But if you find a very ugly building in the city, and then you go to the city archives, you might find a picture of what was there before. That's a very talking image in terms of what we used to have and what we have now. And that effect makes people angry because they realize they lost something they never knew they had. It's also very important in terms of the discussion of how do we defend and preserve our built cultural heritage. Why do we defend it? Why do we need it? What does it say about us as a civilization? But these kinds of clickbaity versions of pictures, like really ugly buildings, and making fun of them, doing comic strips comparing the new opera house to a sinking ship container, doing a comparison between an old Soviet mining town and a new suburb in Stockholm, people think it's funny. And it is, because it's so obvious. It's like the emperor's new clothes. We can all see they're naked. So we just need to say they're naked. And when we do, people laugh. So using very simple kind of ways of explaining very complicated structures within city planning and architecture as humor, as heckling, as comparing. Those things tend to be very effective in a social media context. So lots of people followed us and liked us and wrote things on those posts. So say early in 2014-15, when we had a post with a before and after picture from a city, lots of people from that city wrote things like, I remember this and I saw this and I used to tell my grandchildren about this building, but I never found a picture of it before. This is great. And they became engaged in the movement, and lots of them actually asked, can I do something to help? Can I take a photo of an ugly building? And this resulted in lots of activity from members on the social media groups. So we asked them, why not have a competition? Why not take a photo of all the buildings being built in every city right now, and then we have a competition, which one is the ugliest one? And that skyrocketed. Tens of thousands of people came with they sent pictures and people voted, and newspapers starting writing about this, like there's a competition which is the ugliest building built this year, and which one is the beautiful this year, and which city is the most beautiful city, and which square is the most ugly. So lots of engagement started this giant snowball that just got very big momentum, joining more and more people to our social media channels, and also resulting in lots of media attention. And that's probably also when I myself found the courage to go out in public to talk about these matters, because I was probably in my 4th or 5th year in the school by then. So when a local radio channel said, we want a representative from your group to talk about this, I had the courage to do it sometimes. And that resulted in more and more kind of media attention. So through that, I myself found courage to actually talk about these matters. And I also think that's also the reason why I had the courage to start my own firm.
Yeah, because could you elaborate more on how your activity in the Arkitekturupproret Uprising has affected you as an architect and during studies? How important was the part of being a part of the Arkitekturupproret Uprising?
To me personally, crucial. I'm sure without it I wouldn't have the energy to finish school. Absolutely. Because if you're doing something and you feel quite lonely doing it, and you don't really get the feedback you wish you had, if you all of a sudden find it from somewhere, it gives you lots of energy. And that's my case. I did my best going through architecture school and did my best trying to teach myself about these lost knowledges that's not taught anymore in school, sadly not taught anymore in school, by finding and reading old books mostly. And also I had the chance to attend the Engelsberg Summer School, which is a school which is started by the INTBAU Association, which is founded by Prince Charles of England. So that was absolutely the most important thing as an architect, to be part of a proper school. And even though this was only for a summer, I think I learned more about the things I was interested in myself during that summer than I did in my 5 years in university. Because we had proper education. The first day, We were given a piece of paper and they put an ornament on the floor and they said, draw this. And we did. And a plant, draw this. Then we had a lecture telling us about how does Vitruvius proportions work? Why are those important? Where did they come from? And all of that knowledge that was... Engelsberg is fantastic. INTBAU is fantastic as an organization. That's also one very important reason I had the guts to actually do this myself. But it all happened at the same time. I was still in architecture school at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. Arkitektur Uprising as an organization was growing and growing, and I was also able to attend this summer school. So it all happened at the same time, and it gave me lots of energy. But if you look upon the Arkitektur Uprising as a movement in society, I think also, to me personally, this has happened many times. You sit down on a bus with strangers, and then you overhear a conversation that they're actually talking about buildings. And they're referring to things I wrote 10 years ago on the Arkitektur Uprising site, which is fantastic, or 8 years ago. Fantastic, but it's becoming a popular subject within society, and that gives you lots of power as well, because you feel I'm doing something. I'm making a difference, and I'm doing something I really believe in myself. So to me personally, this has been crucial, absolutely.
And how old were you when you started the Arkitektur Uprising?
I was 19, I think.
19.
I was part of starting it.
Yeah. So, and just as you to refer to the pictures here,
right.
This is the grand institution of the Royal Academy, isn't that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
was that what you expected?
Absolutely not. That's also one of the fun things about my story in terms of education. I'm coming from Sundsvall, which is up in the north in Sweden, and I applied for Royal Institute of Technology and the architecture school. And in my mind, the architecture school was a palace, and those golden letters KTH with these flowers around it and the crown above, it means a lot as a symbol. And I expected that to be a palace. And probably, again, I was naive not to check it out. But I got an address when I was approved at the school, and this was where I came. And it took me and several other new students probably 10 minutes to realize, where is the entrance? How do you enter this building? Because it's built like a fort. Yeah. It's voted several times the ugliest building in Stockholm. It didn't really work as a building in terms of what you expect a building to do either. It rained in a lot, it was very cold, and it was very warm. It was very old as well. So the architecture school is actually moved to an even uglier building. But it says a lot in terms of where the institution is. And the interesting thing, this is a brutalist building, and it was designed in the 1960s. It's said that the reason this building looks the way it does is because it's supposed to be a pedagogical example for the students. For example, there's no covering up on the walls, there's no colors on the walls, because you're supposed to see the joints in the mortar between the concrete blocks. You're supposed to see all the installation. All the electricity is visible, all the ventilation or the pipings, everything's visible. It's almost like Centre Pompidou in Paris. So it's like an inside-out building, and it's supposed to, or at least they say it's that way, so it's clear for a student how the building's actually put together, which personally it makes sense, but not in terms of the results. I don't think that value covers up the ugliness it gives to the city, but it's a terrible building in so many ways. But it says a lot about the architecture school as an institution. The architecture, it's about building stuff, and the building you're housing, the building you're in as an institution, says a lot about the institution itself.
I have one question that I'm excited to hear your answer to, and that is something that often is. It's a question that often is raised by those who are against traditional and classical architecture. and it's a way of gaslighting the problem, saying what is classical architecture?
It's actually a very relevant question on this topic. To start with, I guess if you open the Wikipedia page of classical architecture, it says that classical architecture is the architecture that has its fundamental basis within the antiquity in Greece and Rome, which is true. One can talk about the word classical or classicist or classic or class as social class or your class within school. Class means that it's easy to sort something out. You find a category to put something in. You do a classification of it. That's how the word is. So classical, in a sense, talking about architecture, means that it's a building or a built environment that's reached a certain level of quality within a certain school, and that's a class by itself. So Roman classical architecture is a type of architecture. Greek classical architecture is another one. The interesting thing about those classical is that they've been around for thousands of years. One can say that Greek classical architecture has some basis coming from ancient Egypt as well. So if you look upon it as a timeline, classical architecture, or the architecture from antiquity, is actually just 8,000 years of experience in how to design buildings. It's a kind of method, it's a language, it's a school, it's a toolbox for how to design things. So that's the typical answer, I would say. Then one can say classical Chinese architecture or classical Swedish architecture. Then it means it's a type of buildings, type of built environments that's typical for a place and a time that's risen to a certain quality or became a certain quality, and therefore you can refer to it as an archetype. So using a word I like very much in my mother language, Swedish, is vernacular, something that comes from the local tradition. I would argue that you and I are sitting in vernacular Norwegian chairs. This is not a classical chair because this was probably not in ancient Greece, but it's part of a classical tradition here in Norway, therefore it's classical in a way. So classical architecture as a system, as a toolbox, as a method, is quite big. And in some way you could say that everything that built before 1925 in the Western world that is of decent quality would be a classical building. There's also another definition, which is a classical building is a building that clearly uses the proportions of ancient architecture. The golden section, the natural constant, things that occur in nature, things that are divine constants, things that the Fibonacci spiral, things that occur in nature naturally that we build from, the proportion system, and then also the orders, the columns, the pillar and the lintel, the stone laying upon another stone, the pillar, the arcade, the colonnade. So the orders and the proportions.
Could we say that that if we try to have an as broad description as possible, or as being practical, to say that classical architecture is architecture that has an inspiration they are drawn towards, that they some ideal they are striving for?
Absolutely.
Because
they're
that's
part of this long tradition.
Yeah, and so then it includes this vernacular architecture, and it's and of course most of them in the Western world are traced back to ancient Greece and Rome. But you can also find classical architecture in Chinese traditional architecture.
Absolutely.
Which strives towards the ideals of the past. And
in a way, it's not only endeavor; it also has to reach a certain quality.
Yes, yeah, and because that's what is a very big difference with the modernist architecture, that it's generally not striving towards any ideal. It's striving actually towards breaking up the ideals, trying to create disharmony instead of harmony, trying to create originality, pure originality that has not that you cannot trace back to any ideal. Yep. So it's, to me, that has been, at least in my mind, just some first easy distinction between the two. Because sometimes when talking to professional architects, I've experienced that they confuse the word classical with classicist. Mm-hmm. And so it's like, well, do you just want classicist architecture from this short time span? It's like, no, it's classical. It's that can be at least interpreted as a very large concept.
Absolutely, and it should be, because the classical way of doing art, the classical way of doing architecture, is so much wider than the classicism itself. Classicism has been around for many times in history, but latest in the early 1800s in Europe. And the goal within that kind of classicist architecture was to come close to antiquity and the Renaissance in the structures themselves. So as history's been going on, different culture high periods had died off and been forgotten, and then there's been a discovery again, a renaissance, a rebirth of something, and this has happened several times in architecture. But the classicist period we had in the 1800s is probably the latest one in terms of this endeavor to create proper classical buildings. But there's so much more around that, and sadly these kinds of words in terms of how to define things are very seldom used in a smart way in terms of what you want to say. Because very often while debating an active architect today, probably someone who doesn't really know themselves which ideology they work in, as you said, they interpret the word classical for classicist, which is a big mistake in terms of terminology. But the same thing, and I would say even worse, is when people use the word modern to describe modernism. And it's extremely smart as a word to use modernity in an idea within architecture, because to me modernism is not modern at all. The ideas of modernism came from Siam, the meeting in 1925, the Society of Modernist Architects. And in 1925, Europe is devastated from a great war. And these people, what they do is they blame a lot of their ancestors in society for this great war. They say that everything we've done so far in history led to this terrible war. So the only thing we can do now is to start over. Carte blanche, tabula rasa, from the beginning again. So just all this 8,000 years of knowledge we already have, just throw it out the window and start over. Restart. The simpler the better. The less the better, the less ornament. And always try and invent the wheel again and again and again. And the ironic thing is that there was another war. From 25 to 39. It's not a very long time. But even after the war, this continued as an ideal. Because when Europe was destroyed and devastated and bombed after the Second War, this was a very efficient method of producing fast and simple buildings, because we needed them. There were ruins everywhere in Europe. So this ideal of you don't need to put ornaments on. You don't need to take care of the aesthetics of a building. You could just mass produce them. And one has to remember that these early modernists in the 1930s, in the 1920s, in the 1950s. Most of them, I would say probably all of them, were schooled in traditional schools. So they knew about classical proportion. They knew about the orders. They knew about the craftsmanship that goes in a building. So all of these early modernist buildings are actually built out of brick.
Yeah.
They're handmade, properly handmade. They're high quality buildings in terms of the craftsmanship. But it's such an easy aesthetic to use in mass production that it went quite easy with the new ideologies of society in general after the war. So the impact of it is mostly to defund everything which is in our history. And I'm quite sad to know that when I talk to most active architects about this subject, even though to me it's 100% clear from what they do, what they design, that they're modernists. Their ideas and their ideology is clearly modernist because how their buildings look. But they themselves don't even know why modernism came to be. They themselves don't really know that modernism is an ideology because they've been marinated in this society of architects where it's so self-evident. Everyone knows this is the only truth. It's obvious. This is how you do it. So since they've been, as a group of professional architects, in this kind of idea where only the modernist stigma is around, for them it's the obvious thing to do. And it saddens me a lot to see how many people who are actually active within architecture who don't really know why things are, and even less that there are options, alternatives. So I'm a bit saddened about this, and therefore I blame the schools again. If you have an institution in the building that looks like that, and you have an ideology within the school that promotes this, then you would be stupid if you expected something else from the students coming from that building.
It's interesting what you said about the early modernists, the functionalists, who were classically trained.
Absolutely.
And what I often hear when I discuss architecture with people, that they can refer to these early functionalist buildings and say, well, but this is not that bad, and this is quite. And I think one important point is that it's not black and white. It's not one building is 100% classical, 100% modernist. In buildings you can find, like a functionalist buildings, often I can ask, okay, so what is good with the building? Well, it has the same height as the other building. Well, that's proportions, and it's respecting the surroundings and trying to be harmonious to the surroundings. That's a classical value. So
absolutely.
And so often, or 100% of the times, they're praising the classical aspects
within the modernist structure.
The modernist structure. So, well, but what then do you not like about it? Well, it lacks ornamentation. That's the modernist. It's definitely interesting to see how there are classical aspects in early functionalist buildings, but that knowledge has disappeared.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
But I'm personally doing all I can to read, to learn, to teach others the little I can from that, because it's a forgotten treasure.
Yeah.
And you could probably spend a lifetime just studying classics within architecture and still not read half of it. But you'll have to choose, and you'll have to ask people around. And there are people on this planet who know stuff, who have great knowledge within the classical tradition. And some of them I've met, some of them I bought their books, and they helped me a lot. But this example of a modernist who is trained classically, my favorite example is a Swedish architect named Sigurd Leverens. He worked on the Woodland Cemetery south of Stockholm, which is the only Swedish UNESCO heritage within architecture. And it's really interesting to see what he did in the 1920s and what he did later on. Because he's probably the most speaking example to me of someone who was trained classically, who drew proper classical Swedish grace buildings, but then totally changed and drew extremely modernist buildings. But I tend to like even those, because there's this small quality everywhere of a proper classical knowledge. And his life, in terms of what he did, especially there in the Woodland Cemetery, is really interesting to follow. But absolutely, talking about when people judge buildings, it's really interesting to see also that even a building that totally lacks classical qualities, when you ask people of what they actually like about them, it's very often fundamental values like proportion or ceiling height or daylight, things that should be, in my view, obvious, things that should be at least the minimum you would expect from a building. Which is also very interesting how come people in general who tend to say they like these new structures don't see that. It's interesting.
We talked earlier about the definition of classical, and then that it could be described as striving towards an ideal.
Absolutely.
And a previous guest here on the Cave of Apelles is a Chinese painter, Cheng Wu, and he talked about Taoist philosophy and related it to classical painting. And he said something interesting about how you can have masters that you follow, an ideal that you follow, but the ultimate ideal to follow is nature.
Absolutely.
And I thought you, as a professional, could you talk some about how classical architecture strives towards nature and the importance of that?
Absolutely. I have to make a point upon what you said earlier about striving for an idea. We wrote something about this on our blog as well. There's one clear difference between educated architects and not educated architects when judging architecture. And that has to do with references. Because very often, when, in my eyes, an extremely ugly building is being described by the architect, they very often refer to beautiful values, like nature or like an idea. But the result, in my eyes, has nothing to do with that. It's impossible to see. You could ask 1 million people passing by, what's the idea of this building? And no one would guess what it was. Say, for example, a building in Gothenburg that's colored randomly all the colors you could imagine. And the architect said, I was inspired by the old cranes in the harbor that was painted with rust paint, like blue and yellow and green, and like the paints they had. So it looks like a rainbow. And then the same architect designed a similar building in the north of Sweden. And then all of a sudden he said the inspiration came from a painting. But it's impossible to see if you don't know. And at least to me, I think if you can't appreciate a building without knowing the idea behind it, then it doesn't really matter what you're striving for. Because people in general, non-architects, tend to have very visual references. If things look like a person, if it looks like a typical countryside house, if it looks like a palace, if it looks like a harbor magazine, if it looks the way it does, it's very often to see the intentions within the built structure. But if you strive for an idea, it's not really enough. I totally agree with the beauty of the idea to strive for something. It's really important to have this strive. You have to have an ideal, or at least an idea that you're striving for. But if it's not readable in the structure itself, you probably failed, at least in my eyes. Same thing that Leon Krier says, if your building needs an entry sign, you failed. It should be obvious where you enter. So in terms of classical architecture and nature, first of all, the golden section, the harmonious proportions. If you look at the seeds in a flower, how they're arranged, if you look at how a rock rolls around on the bottom of the sea, if you look upon the seashell, how it grows, or the additive properties of a tree when it grows, most of those things are based on a proportion. And almost always you land in seeing it's a golden section. It's such an harmonious proportion because you have one thing that has the same relation to another thing, and that thing's relation to the both of them. It balances around itself. It's kind of eternal, and in the same way eternal the other way in. You could go deeper and you could go wider without losing the sense of proportion. And if you find that in a pattern, in a floor mat, in a facade, in an ornament, it feels very natural. It feels right. And if you design 2 classical columns and you place them beside, and one has the Vitruvian proportions and the other one it's tweaked just a bit, and you ask 1,000 people which they prefer, a majority will prefer the one that has classical proportions. It's kind of the same thing in terms of how to actually compose a classical facade. It's a reason, like we're millions of people on this planet, but we all have a forehead, eyes, nose and mouth placed the way we have. We can very fast see a face of a human. It's really easy to draw a face of a human because we know from birth how this is supposed to look. We have a feel for it. And most of us don't look the same at all. We have very personal looks. We have attributes that make it personal. That's the kind of same thing you'll have to have within classical architecture. If people say that it's all just the same, then ask them if they think all people are the same because most of them have 2 eyes. So if you base your design, you base your structure upon these laws of nature, and most of them do land upon what's the golden section, both in part and in unit. So it tends to be very natural. It just feels right because we're all used to these things because we see them every day. Most of the things we do see in the world are not created by us. We look at other people. We're human beings. We look at animals. We look at trees, rocks, patterns, the sky, the waves form on the ocean. All those comes from constants in nature. And if we just mimic them, it makes the built environment, the artificial environments we produce for ourselves, feels more like home. Because nature is our home. We all come from nature.
So how... now you answered the question that I was about to ask. I was about to ask, but I can still ask a version of it. That is one value of the of building in a classical manner. But then the opposition to that would be that, well, but why should we follow this to build like nature, to make it recognizable, instead of you can
invent the wheel again.
Yeah, and I want something that is more exciting. I want something that makes me think in a way. That can be the general response to
controversial.
Yes, yep. Something controversial, and not everything has to be
harmonious.
Harmonious, and
you have to allow ugliness.
Yeah, and it's like portrayed in a way that view is boring. Because I want something that is modernistic and exciting. But then the result is just the opposite way, that you see nothing is more boring than the flat concrete facades of the modernist architecture.
This is an extremely interesting topic to open, because this has very little to do with the built environment itself. It has more to do with why we built to start with. The reason we built sheds, houses, buildings, skyscrapers, roads, is because we as a society want to be protected from the wind and the weather. We want to fit people in a structure because it's comfortable for us. The goal of architecture has a function. That function is quite easily reached today. So then the looks of it, how does architecture portray itself in aesthetics? And why does it? That's the question. We could do skyscrapers that's probably a kilometer high. We could do buildings that are totally black if we want to. We are free as a society and with the technology we have on hand to create almost everything. There are of course boundaries, but that in itself is not interesting to me. What's interesting is what we say with what we built. Because if you study society in general and you look upon things that's been around for 1,000 years, what things do we leave behind? What impact do we do as human beings, as people? And one of the things that's most recognizable as almost constants that exist throughout history is the borders we draw. Where a street starts and where a plot starts. Where the border between a country is or not. And very often those tend to follow nature. But think about next time you take a shortcut around the corner in the world. The reason that corner is there is probably because 1,000 years earlier a cow took that road and then a person did. And after 5 people, that was a track. And that track developed into a road. And when the society close by grew, they placed the house close to the road because they couldn't cut the road off. So the patterns we leave are extremely constant in history. They tend to stay very long, not forever, but very, very long. Same goes with the built environment. Lots of us have buildings close by that's older than generations we can count. So what we build says more about us today than anything else we do. So the question is not how a building is supposed to look. It's actually what kind of society, what kind of built environment do we want to leave for our grandchildren? What do we want our buildings to say about ourselves? I'm for democracy. I like democracy as a way of ruling. I think it's the least bad way of ruling a society we have. So when we talk about architecture, especially in a cityscape or city planning, if you're going to use democracy, you'll have to ask people what they think, what they like, what they want. And if you think about the streetscape with buildings on 2 sides, it almost creates a room. In that room, the street room, the walls are actually the facades of the buildings. So in the same way we hang up paintings in our apartments or in our houses, in the same way we have ornaments or we paint our walls, the facades of the buildings are actually the walls of our common spaces. Our markets, our squares, our streets, our countryside. The things we look upon. And inside the building, if you look at this, the typical building wherever in the world, how many people sees it from the outside and how many people sees it from the inside? In most cases, I would say almost all of them, more people see the outside than the inside. And more people in democracy means more power in terms of judgment. So what I'm saying is, if we want to leave a democratic society behind us and think about what is actually persistent from us, what do we leave behind? That means what we build, what we produce, the cities we give to our grandchildren has to be anchored in the public opinion of what they like. And we know from study to study, from survey to survey in all of the Western world that a crushing majority wants classical.
When you when you talked about, I think it was a good point when you said that if an architect strives towards an ideal, but no one can see
the point of it is useless. The point of it,
yeah, then that reminded me of, I'm reading Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times now, and in it, in the beginning of the book, it is this typically Dickens authoritative teacher, not a good man, and he has this power over the students there, the young students, and he is all about reason. Everything has to be described in reason, and he asked these questions to these poor children. So if you are decorating your wall and you want to have and someone suggests to have decoration of horses on that wall, would you do that? And the children answer, yes, no, because the reason is you can never see a horse running on the wall, and use this stupid reason, and then use so. And if you're having a carpet, would you decorate it with flowers? And this little girl is like, yes, no, because you don't have flowers inside a house
on the floor,
and if so, you don't step on the flowers. And she responds, but I like flowers. And it's so it's this idea of things being so rational, while in reality it makes no sense, because he's not being rational at all. He just thinks this, and he don't care about what actually people like. That why are you decorating at all? It's to get something beautiful inside your home.
Absolutely. This Dickens story is quite an example, because this is actually very true in city planning. There are numerous examples in Sweden, probably in all of the world, where you had this very often socialist idea of how someone was supposed to live. We have those in the Soviet Union as well, where apartments was built on a railroad track almost out in the forest somewhere. Ginormous concrete structures where all the apartments was supposed to be exactly alike, because that was the most reasonable in terms of it should be equal. It took like 2 weeks. Then people had curtains. Then people had interior decoration, furniture. And because we are animals, we want to make our homesteads personal. Not all of us, but most. And that idea of creating an anthill of identical units to make the equal person in a socialist utopia never works, because people are different. We are personal human beings. We have a personality. We do like different things, and we tend to create things in the way we want. So in a way, decorating or choosing the furniture or the paintings or the curtains or the things you have around you in your house, in your home, where you live, is also a reflection of who you are. So one should almost always encourage people to create something of their own, because that also means they like it. So I'm very much against the idea of intruding in the private space as the home, as the interior. And of course, a very common counter-argument is, yeah, but can't I decide for myself what kind of building I want? Of course you can, but you'll have to make sure that not a majority of your neighbors dislike it, because then you can't be part of the cityscape. Then you'll have to build somewhere else where people actually like it. And that would then mean that our cities, our societies, our villages would become more diverse, because then one village has a specific type of way of building, and another one has a totally different one, even if they might be in the same country. And what we inherited from our ancestors in terms of built environment is very often an effect of their local scape, their tradition, their vernacular tradition, which means people tend to like it because there's a reason they live where they live and they like it. So we have millions of different interesting styles in buildings and built environments on this planet. But modernism has made it unrecognizable where a project is. I've shown pictures of a skyscraper to people lots of times and asked them, where is this? And you get replies like, it's probably New York, Rio de Janeiro, Tokyo, Australia, whatever, but it's Stockholm. it's impossible to know from lots of, or most modernist building, if it's not a uniquely famous one for escape. But if you take a photo of a traditional farmhouse in Belgium, Australia or Norway, it's very easily recognizable that this is a Norwegian type of building. It's built out of the local material. It uses the color scheme which comes from the ground very often. And the traditional way of building is very often anchored into the opinion of people, because most people like the things they have around them. That's the reason why they live there. And then they don't want it to be standardized. They want to know if they live in Bergen or New York. They want to know if they live in Sydney or in Tokyo. Because it's a logical thing, and it's a good thing that it's different, because that also gives lots more value to traveling. If I go on vacation to a country, I want to see their kind of buildings. I don't want to see the standardized building I can find at home. Then there's no reason to travel if I want to see architecture. So it's also, in the same kind of manner, we should encourage people to do private spaces within their houses. We should also encourage cities and villages to develop into their own scape, because it makes them unique. It gives us more.
So this democratic process, has this got any resonance in the Swedish political
Absolutely.
sphere?
It's been crazy how big of an impact it's already had.
So has some political parties or townships
lots of them, yes,
started to either do this or to have it in their political program?
All Swedish political national parties have it already in their programs to some extent. Okay. As far as I know, and the election is coming up in a week, so there's still more time to add.
So this specific solution of
not that solution, but the clarification that this is an important subject in society.
Okay,
but we have lots of examples, especially on the municipality local level, in terms of areas where they implement this as a rule, or specific projects where they let the people in the vicinity in the area to actually vote. What do you want? Ask them. And there's also been probably one of the most popularized in media, a project north of Stockholm in a region, in a municipality called Upplands Väsby, where they actually made an architectural program demanding these kinds of styles of facades is the ones we want. Please contribute to a design, and then we'll vote which one is going to be built. And this was very recent. So in probably 2 or 3 years, we'll see big multi-house, like what do you call them? Apartment houses, where the idea for the facades, or at least aesthetics of the facades, actually comes from the politics, where they actually demanded this. So we have lots of examples, and the general discussion going on, or the general value conversation, is lots of people in politics who represent the people who voted for them, realize that many architects, both professional who design buildings and also the ones working within the municipality and the city board to decide what's being built or not, they're not at all interested in what the public wants. They have their own agenda. And that's almost fun to see how fast and how clear that the emperor's nude reaction is. How angry people get when they realize that they have no power, even though they're elected in politics, because there's someone sitting in a table in the city board planning what they personally think. So we very much opened up the collision between those two opinions, that the public should decide and I as a professional should decide. So we shone light on this problem to an extent which is, I personally think it's very fun, because it's such a shock for so many people. I knew this, but it's clear when you read newspapers about this and articles about this that people are really shocked, because they thought that this was a democratic process, but it isn't. But hopefully it will be, and it's already becoming.
But since to go back to your hometown, and I guess you would be quite satisfied if either you were drawing some buildings looking like this, or some other people.
It would be a great honor.
Yeah. Some modernists, though, would call this kitsch.
Absolutely.
Pastiche.
Yeah.
Disneyland.
Yeah.
What's your answer to that?
In a way, they're right. A pastiche is something done in honor to something older, something other. It's not a copy, but it's a glorification of something else. It's the same thing that if a musical band, does a cover of another artist's song, it's very seldom because they want to steal it. It's because they want to celebrate that. And I've heard no one criticizing a musical band for doing a cover song of someone else's song. And very often it's not the original song that's gotten the most famous either. Most of the buildings we love today are actually copies or inspired by older architecture. I think mimicking is probably the oldest way of learning. It's a natural way of doing things. And if you recognize that these buildings have 8,000 of years of experience put into them, I would consider that you're stupid, or at least not thinking straight, if you don't see the value in all of that experience. If you refuse to use it, if you refuse to learn from it, then why? So yes, pastiche shouldn't be a bad word. A pastiche is celebrating something that already exists. Kitsch, it's another kind of word for the same thing, I would say. And to me, that's not a problem at all. And Disneyland, there's a reason millions of people travels to Disneyland. It's an attraction. There's a reason millions of people traveling to see the city of Paris. There's a reason people travel to the Forbidden City in Beijing. There's a reason why people visit the medieval old towns of our cities. Like, where do people want to go? Why do you see tourist shops everywhere in Old Town in Stockholm, but almost no one in the modernist suburbs? Why is there no tourist shops in the modernist cityscapes? Why are there no tourists going around in the modernist city centers of London? Because they're all in the picturesque traditional areas. So I would say, who wouldn't like to live in Disneyland? To be honest, like, not the park itself, but I would like to live in a place where all the buildings around me are made to make me happy, are made to create a harmony, are made to work together as a symphony of architecture.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind to live in that castle.
Absolutely. You could be Cinderella. No, but I agree that it's a kind of a childish argument in a way.
Yeah.
Because we already know this sells. People want this. And I myself tend to very often anchor the reason I'm doing this, or I find reason to do this in the knowledge that most people actually like this. Most people don't mind if things are beautiful around them. And sure, it's not very original to do a copy of something. But then why does everything has to be inventing the wheel again? I myself, I'm not against modernism per se. I'm against not having a distribution of our built environment that actually mirrors what people in the society want. So I don't want to forbid modernism. I want to teach people about what it actually is. I want to teach people about there's options. And I want to inform the public that it's us as a people in the democracies that actually can choose this.
I heard that when Walt Disney was designing Disneyland, he had some trouble finding architects that actually could draw the main square.
I wouldn't be surprised at all.
No. And
the first one in California was built in the 1950s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That would have been problematic to find people who actually knew it.
I heard that he had to find architects that had to actually learn this craft, and many of them actually continued as traditional architects afterwards.
Fantastic.
Instead of going back.
The same. I cried a lot when I saw the fire in Notre Dame. That day was totally destroyed for me personally. But then I heard a press conference of a stonemason, and he honestly said, quite directly after, that this is the best thing that happened to my profession. Because this means we'll have 4 generations of proper stonemasons having work.
Yeah.
So if you stop using a craft in society, you'll also lose the knowledge. And this is what happened in the 1920s when the modernist ideas spread around the world. So even in the 1950s, it was hard to find something who knew this. Imagine how it is today, 70 years later. So even though Notre Dame is a tragedy in every way, this means that you will have stonemasons working on repairing the church for probably 2 or 3 generations. And this means the knowledge of how to do it will be preserved. So because of this Disneyland park, people had to learn a forgotten knowledge. And because of that, that knowledge was out in the market and people wanted it. So those projects that are pilots, the first ones, they're so important because those are the stepping stone for the next project, and it just puts even more experience and more knowledge into every project. So the goal would be that when I retire, there would be 500 classical architecture firms in Scandinavia, all teaching each other and learning from each other and doing projects that actually develops on each other, pastiches of another project. That would be fantastic because that's how you learn. If I want to learn sailing, I do it from someone who already know it. I don't sit down in a sailboat and chance myself. Knowledge has to be taught and seen and done, and you have to copy. That's the best way of learning, I think.
So we have been through many changes that has happened recently with the Arkitekturupproret Uprising and with new traditional architecture project or classical architecture project that are happening. It seems like the tide is turning, and but you still have one great fear, isn't that right?
Absolutely. I referred to it as my greatest fear earlier. If one looks upon this in context, zoom out, we had an era of postmodernism within architecture. And I personally think that there's great examples of postmodernism, especially in Sweden, where, again, the ideas, the ideologies that people strive for were great, beautiful thoughts. But sadly, they lacked the knowledge, the tools, and the craftsmanship to get there. So there are lots of projects in the postmodern era, in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, that had understood that the modernist era is not doing us any good anymore. The built environments we get from modernism is not attractive. We want to try something else. And the first thing you do if you realize that I'm on the wrong path is turn around. So if one looks upon architecture history as a tree, it all comes from the roots up in the trunk and then branches. I think that it's a very disproportionate tree because it has one very long, weird branch, and we're out on that. And to have the tree stable, you'll have to have equal long branches because otherwise the tree flips over or the branch actually breaks because you go through so long out. And it feels like we've hit this wall where we can't get any further within modernist ideology, and we still try to push through it by going further and further and further away from what was actually good, or at least actually appreciated. So during the postmodern era, lots of architects tried to go backwards. I think Venturi wrote in Learning from Las Vegas that if it is that bad, why is it so damn interesting in terms of postmodern buildings in Las Vegas, copying a Greek temple or a pyramid or the skyline of Manhattan? So we had an era already where architects and designers tried to go backwards and learn from the proper classics. But what happened was that the results of this, and sadly it's mostly the results that counts because that's what we leave behind, wasn't really up to quality. It's very few postmodern buildings that are actually that good. And I blame it took too long. Societies lost the knowledge how to do proper classical buildings. It took too long. So they should have done the same thing that Walt Disney done. They should have educated themselves first and then designed. That would have probably been a better result. So what happened was the postmodern era in architecture died. And we went back to a neo-modernism. In the Swedish context, we talk about new modernism. So because of that, I'm afraid we might do the same thing again. I'm really afraid that what we're doing, or the aim of what we're doing here, is going way too fast. Because even if we turn the politics, even if we already know that most people want this, who is going to do it? There are almost no architects, designers or craftsmen around that know how to do proper classical buildings. And therefore, it doesn't matter if people crave bus journeys to Mars. It doesn't matter if 99% of people vote for them. If they're not around, you won't get them. So I'm really afraid that we'll end up with really bad classical architecture, or at least bad tries of making the masses happy while using methods that doesn't at all belong to traditional architecture. So there is a great risk now that this is all going too fast and will end up with a result no one wanted. Just bad versions of classicism or classical architecture or traditional architecture done by people, by craftsmen, by planners who don't really know how to do it. So back again to that building. I think the most important thing we could do now, doesn't really matter anything else, is make sure that the new students that enter universities, the new craftsmen that enter building schools, get a chance to choose to do things classically. We have to revive and dig for that knowledge in the libraries, in the treasure chest we have around us in terms of the built environments we already get. We have to allow ourselves to copy. We have to allow ourselves to train by copying, by doing pastiche, because that's the only tool we'll have when we'll have the chance to actually produce it. So we'll see, but there's a grave risk we'll end up in a second postmodernism, and that would be tragic. But then there's another thing, which I think is quite crucial in terms of where we are today as a society. The word sustainable is very popular because of climate debate, because of energy debate, because of how we use our resources. Sustainability is very important. It's very central in most of the things we do today as a modern society. But then one has to remember, at least in my point, there's 3 different types of sustainability. One is the most obvious one. It has to sustain. A building has to be able to stand. It has to be able to take the use from us. It can't break. It has to be sustainable as a fixed structure. It has to have quality so it doesn't break when we use it. Then we'll have the ecological point. It has to be sustainable in terms of a cycle, in terms of how we use the materials, how it works, how we use the heating, how we use the ventilation, what kind of materials we use, and how long a building actually stands, which is probably the most important thing while judging how environmentally friendly a building is. It's very little to do with the energy consumption right now. It's how flexible it is and how long it stands. Most of the buildings in our cities in Europe has been around for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Most of them were built for one use and then changed and changed again and changed again and changed again, because they're so flexible. You can change them. You don't have to demolish them. Therefore, all those rocks and all the bricks and all the pans on the roof, they've paid themselves off 1,000 times in terms of eco-cycle. So ecology in terms of what material we use actually speaks for using traditional building materials. And just to develop on that, there's a great example, I think. Most people know, especially here in Norway, that Bergen is the city in Europe where it rains the most. If you look upon a traditional house in Bergen, what direction does the facade, the wood panel go? Horizontal or vertical?
Yeah, I know the answer, horizontal.
Yeah, and why is this?
It's for the... if you have to change the bottom parts closest to...
because the roof hangs out.
Yeah.
So the top part of the facade is actually protected from the rain, but the bottom part takes more damage from rain. So you will have to change the boards once in a while. But if you lay them horizontally, you'll only have to change the ones below. If you look at the new buildings built in Bergen today, they all have vertical facades. It's like going against the rules of nature. Yeah. So there's so much to learn in this vernacular architecture, in the traditional way of building, because the reason it looks the way it does is because our ancestors have built with the rules of nature. They've used nature because it's efficient. They didn't even have the chance to work against it. But today we're just ignoring all of that knowledge. So back again to sustainability. It's a lot more environmentally friendly to build in a traditional manner. And then the third thing in terms of sustainability, which I personally think is the most important. Why does things last in time? It's because we like them. If I like this chair, I won't throw it away. If I like my house, I won't demolish it. If I like a piece of jewelry because I've inherited from my grandmother, I keep it, I take care of it better. And if we take care of the things we already have, there's less need of producing new things. And that is also environmentally friendly. So if we make sure that the things we build are stable, they'll sustain themselves physically. They'll sustain themselves in the eco-cycle and working with nature, but not against. And they'll sustain themselves within what we think is beautiful. Then we'll have a three-unity that's perfect for our future generations. So we have to think about beauty, quality, and the cycles of nature, which all three, I think, lacks in what we build today in general. Modernist architecture today lacks all of those.
And on that note,